This is second lecture on parables. Let me review what we did last time real quickly. An introduction. I wanted to introduce the parables the way that I did last class period because some of us operate under the assumption that parables are sort of the Christianity 101, the childhood Sunday school lesson material. And I kind of wanted to blow that out of the water because it just simply is not true that what we have in the parables are simple stories intended for a sort of non-challenging, clear explanation of what Jesus taught about the kingdom of God. Simply is not true. The first clue to that is that when he started teaching in parables, it generated questions. The questions that it generated came from his disciples. They were like, why are you doing this? And what do these mean? So, inasmuch as the parables themselves generated questions, we looked at the answer that Jesus gave, and it's recorded in these three passages, Mark chapter 4, Matthew 13, Luke 8. We kind of disassembled those passages a little bit just to show you that not only was the parable that Jesus told a little bit confusing, but so was the answer that he gave. We concluded that Mark says that parables are riddles and that they're intended to conceal truth. And that's why they generated some confusion in the audience, some what does this mean types of reactions. The third thing is that Mark includes in this explanation a quotation of Isaiah chapter 6 used as a sort of fulfillment text. This is done in order that it might be fulfilled, Isaiah 6, 9, and 10. And the point is that it's to prevent restoration or forgiveness. I'm talking about restoration as a sort of process of spiritual restoration with God. And it seems like the parables, if they're riddles, their intention is to push people away from an understanding. And so that the reason that some people didn't understand Jesus' teaching is because it's Jesus' fault. That's not to play a blame game or say something negative about Jesus. It just simply describes this intention about parables. That some people don't get it, and consequently, the process of restoration with God stops right there. And Jesus tells these obscure stories with the intention of making that happen. Then we looked at Matthew. Matthew uses the same question-answer dialogue with Jesus that Mark does, except he changes a couple of words, and we saw that. He turns a purpose clause into a result clause. He elaborates further on a passage from Isaiah chapter 6. But essentially what he ends up saying is that the parables aren't riddles that are intended to conceal truth. They're clear stories that are intended to reveal truth and nurture restoration. And that the reason some people were seeing and not understanding is or the reason that there was not comprehension taking place, is that the people were having trouble understanding. And so, according to Matthew, it's the people's fault. Then we went to Luke, and Luke gives the most satisfactory resolution to this crux that we've encountered. And he gives us a very helpful and profound presentation of this whole pericope, this whole sequence of discussion with the disciples and Jesus. And he sheds considerable light on what looks to be almost an impossible problem. The light that he sheds is basically, Matthew is right, and so is Mark. They're both right. Sometimes parables are riddles. Sometimes they do conceal the truth. Sometimes they do prevent restoration. Sometimes they are revealing stories and nurture restoration. They do both things. The way that Luke explains how that happens is that he tells us, he presents this all in the context of the telling of one parable, and that's the parable of the sower. So I told you that that parable, probably maybe the most famous parable of Jesus, next to, it's probably not, probably the most famous parable of Jesus is the parable of the prodigal son. And maybe after that is the parable of the Good Samaritan. But after that, it would be, I think, the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower should be, though, at the very beginning of our study of parables, because it is a parable about parables. Jesus is the sower. The seed that he's sowing are the parables. These parables are landing on different kinds of soil. That soil represents different kinds of hearts inside of you. And there's only a 25% chance, according to, the way this parable is told, that the parable is going to land on a heart that will actually grab it, nurture it, and massage it into a life-changing experience. So a parable will only produce change. It will only nurture restoration and forgiveness if the person who hears it is very careful about the way they hear. So, Luke basically says, there's a lot of things going on here, but fundamentally, it's up to you. It is up to you. This parable can die as soon as it's heard. There's 3 ways that can happen. The first is the enemy of God can come and actually steal away in a very mysterious way. I'm not sure I can explain how this might happen, but it happens. There is a spiritual warfare going on in our lives that we don't see. That's one of the ways this can happen. There's another way. You can receive the story in the parable with joy, but then immediately you encounter a time of testing, which, by the way, is probably also part of the strategy of God's enemy, because he is the tempter. And that word, a time of testing, I told you when we discussed the temptation of Jesus, that temptation and test, those are the same Greek word. He is the tempter, and so it is in a time of temptation or testing that you fall away. You may know people that have gone through this. They received it with joy. You thought, wow, there's a changed life. A year later, you see them. There's no evidence at all. There's a falling away that occurs. The third kind is this soil. It lands on or in some bushes. Obviously, there's soil there that can produce life, but there's just too much other stuff there. Okay, there's bushes and there's weeds, and this represents all the other stuff that we're busy with. And it just sort of pushes this story, this parable, pushes it to the margins of our life, and eventually it's just gone. Because we're busy with stuff. I mean, I've got 15 appointments today. I've got money to make, people to see, parties to go to. And our lives are filled with this kind of distraction if we're not careful. We live in a world that is really good at putting all kinds of distractions in front of us. That's very dangerous, Jesus says. Very dangerous. You see it all the time. Television, advertising. There are so many things for you to fill your life with. And you need to be careful about what you fill your life with. It might turn you into one of those soils where there just wasn't space for this. And the fourth soil is the only one that actually does produce fruit. Not a very good percentage. But I think this is cool. This is what I like about this. I'm familiar, at least in my experience with Christianity, I know a lot of people who treat Christianity as though it is all a mind game, It's a conversion. You believe, you're saved, that's it. That's not at all the way this is played out with the parables. Because you see, in Jesus' explanation of all of this, the key is fruit. Fruit, when it's produced by a plant, is evidence that there's life in that plant. In fact, if you remember your paper on the parables in Matthew, fruit is critical. Remember the parable of the tares? The wheat is sown in this field, starts to grow, then at night the enemy comes and plants a bunch of weed seeds, and they start to grow. I grew up in the Midwest. I've harvested a lot of wheat. And one thing is really true about this parable. You don't really know what's a weed and what's wheat until harvest, when the wheat produces fruit and the weed doesn't. They look a lot the same. So we're looking for fruit here. We are looking for a changed life. That's what I'm talking about with these parables, a changed life. Okay? I might move you with an explanation of these stories. You might walk out of here and think, wow, that was cool, or something like that. But you know what really matters? What really matters is whether or not these stories change your life. That's what matters. And I'm almost willing to say, if they don't, I'm really sorry for you. Because that's what Jesus is looking for. He's not looking for you to go to church and say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Because what does he say? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? He also says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. He even says to people at the judgment, but didn't we cast out demons in your name? Jesus says, I never knew you. So here's what Jesus wants from you. He wants fruit. And if a parable produces fruit, then it has turned into a clear story that reveals truth and nurtures restoration. If it doesn't produce fruit, it's a riddle. Why? Because it hasn't done this. If it doesn't, it conceals the truth. It dies. It's a seed. So, before we start looking at these parables, let me quote Jesus. Watch how you listen. Take care how you listen. Okay? Very serious about this. This is life-changing stuff here. This isn't the milk of Jesus' teaching. This is the meat of his teaching. So, with that, I would like to move to a discussion of one of the first sort of domains that the parables are about. And this one is about discipleship. I have 3 parables. And if I get through these in plenty of time, I might move on and do another domain. But here's the domain of these parables. There's 3 parables that I've selected that sort of are in the same kind of ballpark regarding their subject matter. I drew this because some of you are familiar with the yin and yang of Taoism, Confucianism. Yin and yang means that there's a plus and a negative, a weak and a strong, a good and a bad, and it's all part of a system. And I'm not saying there's yin and yang in Jesus' teaching. It's a concept that wasn't really in Hebrew wisdom, but it does get me to this point, and that is that there's something easy and something hard about following Jesus. Okay? Let me read you a passage. This is in Luke chapter 14. It's the only place in the Gospels where Jesus says that if you don't do this, you cannot be my disciple. So we always present Christianity as such an open arm type of thing, such an easy, welcome, come, blah, 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 okay? And I have never heard this passage used at an evangelistic crusade. And you'll figure out why. Great multitudes, I'm in 14:25. Great multitudes were going along with him, and he turned and he said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Twice he says, cannot be my disciple. It's the only place it occurs in the Gospels, in the New Testament. It occurs once in the Gospel of Thomas. But this is the only place it occurs. You don't do this, you cannot be my disciple. Jesus said it, not me. It sounds very harsh, doesn't it? If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and his own life, Aramaic scholars tell me that the reason Jesus says hate here is because in Aramaic, that was the way that they said love less. Okay, they didn't have hate, but the way to say love someone less is to say hate, okay? It's a comparative statement here. Jesus is saying, if you love anyone more than me, you cannot be my disciple. That's harsh. And he doesn't pick stuff that's easy to love less, does he? I mean, he goes right for the hard stuff. Your family. Some of you guys are very close to your family. Your mother, your father, your sisters. And in not too many years, some of you will be married. Maybe you are already. And you'll have children. Maybe you have children already. If you have children, you know what I'm saying when I say that there is almost nothing so life-changing and powerful as the bond between a parent and a child, a dad. It's nothing. And so for Jesus to say this, I mean, I don't know if, I'm sure that Dr. Laura would not like this statement. And yet here it is, almost at the doorway to Christianity. It's at the front door. And you can't even walk through the door. So it's not like you can't be my disciple unless you love me more than watching football. That's easy. That's a no-brainer. But how about you can't be my disciple unless you love me more than your mom and your dad and your little sister and your wife and your daughter. That is not easy. Who in the world is going to follow him? That's a good question, isn't it? Sometimes when I look at the things Jesus required of his disciples, I think, you know, if I was living then and I was there, I wonder if I would have followed him. I really do. I wonder if I would have been one of them. That's his statement. You must put me first. Then he goes on with two parables and he explains a little bit of how this actually works. And this is fun. So here's two short parables from the Gospel of Luke. Both of these only occur in Luke's Gospel. So if you encounter these on the gospel content exam, and you know this is from Luke, okay? Here's the parable number 1. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. And they're laughing at him. I've been a carpenter for 30 years. And I've seen this happen. I've seen people who started a project, and I don't know whether they didn't do the math or whether something else happened. But I've seen houses that got to a certain stage of construction and then everything stops. And the good wood turns brown and, you know, and it gets old and it never gets finished. Pretty soon the weather starts to delaminate the plywood. All kinds of things happen And everybody who drives by knows exactly what happened. Or at least they make a guess. These people couldn't afford to finish a project they started. Ha, ha, ha. Some of you are business majors. You have a lot of business savvy. You know this whole process of doing the math. You know, it's all about numbers, isn't it? Estimating the cost to actually finish something that you begin. And so the question that this parable leaves you with as you read the parable is this: can I afford to? Very simple. That's the purpose of this parable. It's a story that leads you to a question, and that's all Jesus wants you to do, is ask that question. Can I afford to? Okay? Can you afford to? You might say yes, and you might say no. Now, at this point, either answer is an option. Jesus wants you, before you begin on this path of being His disciple, He wants you to answer that question. Can you afford to do this? You know, if you want to stop now, that's fine. Say no, that's fine. You want to say yes, that's okay too. But some of you may think, no, I can't afford to do this. The second parable is the parable of the warring king. And it follows right on the heels of this first parable. Okay? And interestingly enough, it leaves us with a different question. Here's the parable. Or, what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and take counsel, whether he's strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other one is still far away, he sends a delegation and tries to barter for terms of peace. So here's the second parable. Let me illustrate it for you. Typical scenario in the ancient world: two different kings and their armies. One of them is over here, and he's got his army all bivouacked here, and he's got all the horses in. Yeah, I might be able to draw a horse. Okay, horses and chariots, and they're sitting up here with a little fire, and he's standing there with his generals. The sun's going to go down in about a half an hour, and they're all kind of relaxed, getting ready, because in the morning they're going to go down into the valley and they're going to fight with this guy who's doing the same thing over here. Okay? There's an army over here. So we've got King A, King B. This guy's army is a little bit bigger. And he's got a big, I'm not going to draw a horse. Horses. Okay. So these guys are sitting there, sipping their coffee, relaxing, having a s'mores. And one of them glances over at the other army, and he starts counting the tents. And he counts 100 tents. 5-man tent, 5 or 10-man tent, 100 of them. Figures out that's a lot of soldiers. He turns around and he counts his tents, and they have like half that many. So then he goes to the king and he goes, you know what? I was thinking, I noticed that the guy over here has 5 times as many tents as we do. And I counted the horses, and he has like 500 horses with chariots, and we have like 50. And we have 5 tents, and he's got 50. That's a pretty big army over there. Then he says further, he goes, I'm thinking if we go down into the valley tomorrow morning and fight this guy, we're all going to die. So the king looks over there and counts the tents, turns around and he counts his and goes, yeah, you're right. This is a suicide mission here. He goes, so I tell you what I want you to do. Put up the white flag. I want you to walk over there and talk to the king over there. Tell him we just got a message from home that we've got an emergency at home. There's a fire at home. We've got to go home, take care of it. But we'll meet them back here next month, and then we'll fight. But we just have to go. Sorry. So you go tell him that. So the general goes over there and he sits down with the king. And the king knows what's going on, King B. He knows exactly what's going on. So he sits there and he listens. And the guy says, we'd love to fight you in the morning, but we just found out we have to go. But we'll be happy to do this again, next month or whenever. So King B says, well, okay. So I guess I can let you go. I can let you go. But there's going to be some terms to this new contract. And the terms are that you have to give me all of your weapons, all of your chariots, all of your horses, all your money, plus in a couple of days, I'll send some of my men with you, but in a couple of days, I want all of your goats and sheep and cattle and horses at home. I want you to bring those back to me. Plus, on the first day of every year, I want 25% of your gross national product every year. But yeah, you guys can go. He writes it up, and he asks this general to sign an agreement to give all these things. Now, the general of King A is in kind of a delicate situation, isn't he? Because if he doesn't sign, what's going to happen? They're going to die. Is this a hard decision? It's not really a hard decision because there's only one decision to be made, but it isn't a very comfortable one, granted. But this parable adds a little bit to this situation, doesn't it? Here's the crisis question that this parable leads you to. So parable 1 is, can you afford to? Yes or no? Parable 2 is, can you afford not to? And there's only one answer to that question. Because King B is bigger than you are. You cannot say no to King B. You can't. He's bigger than you are. It's a power play here. So I hate to say that Jesus is pulling rank on you, but he's pulling rank on you. Okay? And I've got you guys in this classroom, and I've led you to a point where you have to make a decision. Now you can say, I can't afford to follow him for this and this and this reason. And admittedly, those might be good reasons. You know, maybe you come from a family where Christianity is despised, and if you become a Christian, you're no longer a daughter or a son. In some countries that happens. Not usually here in America. But this second parable of the warring king, it says basically, can you afford to refuse his demands? Jesus is King B. Can you afford to refuse his demands? And the answer is no. The answer is no. You cannot afford to say no to him. So you got to realize, guys, that if you say no to him and walk out this door today, there's consequences. I don't know what they'll be exactly. I don't know what they'll be. But I know he's bigger than you are. He's got more men in his army, and he's stronger than you are. And it might get nasty. So anyway, this is the not easy part of discipleship, and I can see why Billy Graham doesn't, do it this way. Because this is kind of a power play. And I wanted to start out with this power play to show you what's at stake. But I want to show you something else that you won't find at all in these parables, okay? There's another dimension to this. There's a completely other dimension to this whole relationship between Jesus and his disciples. And that's this one in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. Let me read this passage to you. Now one of the Pharisees was requesting Jesus to dine with him. And he entered the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at the table. Then, behold, there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. That's a euphemism for a prostitute. So, that probably caused some conversation. There was a woman in the city who was a sinner, and when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster vial of perfume. And she stood behind him at his feet, weeping. And she began to wet his feet with her tears. And she kept wiping them with the hair of her head, and kissing his feet, and anointing them with the perfume. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she is a prostitute. She's unclean. Then immediately, Jesus answers his thoughts. Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. This is where it gets really good. I have something to say to you. And he replied, say it, teacher. And he tells him a parable. You know what? Jesus was lethal with parables. Did you just notice that here? He was lethal. Here's his parable to Simon. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed him 500 denarii, and the other owed him 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. Which of them, therefore, will love him more? This seems like a totally benign question, doesn't it? It's not only, this is an easy parable. This is easy. This parable also leads to a question. Which will love him more? This is simple. And Simon, it's really funny. Guys, it's hilarious to read this in Greek. It's possible reading it in English to follow this, but what you get is Simon has a certain boldness, okay? And it's fun to watch this boldness just sort of disappear as he gets further into the conversation with Jesus. It starts out with, if this man were a prophet, he would know, okay? Starts out with that in his thoughts. Jesus answers him and says, I have something to say to you. And Simon says, go for it, teacher. You're cocky, bold. Then he says, Jesus tells the parable, asks the question. Simon says, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. Do you notice the trepidation that is creeping into his response to Jesus? I suppose. I think Simon just started to feel like he had been pushed into a corner, and now he was going to have to figure a way out. Simon said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And Jesus said, you have judged correctly. Then he turned to the woman, and he said to Simon, do you see this woman? Of course he saw the woman. Okay, that's what this is all about. Simon knew who this woman was. He didn't think Jesus did. So somehow, this whole thing is going back to the woman. I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with perfume. You, she, you, she, you, she. Very interesting. There's two people in the parable. Okay? Person number one, person number two. They're both forgiven. This guy's forgiven $1 million. This guy is forgiven $50. Who's going to love more? The person who's been forgiven more. So this unbelievable act of forgiveness, in this case, is going to be reflected in great gratitude on the part of that person. This person here, because it was not as much money, there will be lesser gratitude. That's when Jesus starts in with these you, she, you, she. This is brilliant, what Jesus has just done. He is illustrating two people in that room and their behavior. And he's based upon their behavior, he's making an evaluation as to whether or not one or both has experienced forgiveness. For this reason I say to you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven, for she loves much. But he, and he doesn't say you, he doesn't say you, but he means you, okay? But he who is forgiven little, loves little. You know what happened here? Jesus just shamed Simon in his own house. He just put him down big time. This is a major diss on Simon. Here Simon was sitting there thinking, my house has been polluted with the presence of this prostitute, and this man who calls himself a prophet doesn't even know, and blah, blah, blah. He's creating this whole scenario in his mind. And what does Jesus do? He turns around and he tells a parable, and he makes this woman who Simon really didn't like. He makes this woman the hero of the story. Touché. Isn't it something what Jesus can do with behavior? He looks at her behavior, and he concludes, based upon her great love, that she has been forgiven great things. Do you ever do that? Think about that? That if you have experienced forgiveness, that it has to produce something. It has to. In fact, if there is nothing produced, Jesus ventures to say that there was nothing forgiven. Isn't that the way you hear this parable? Isn't that the way you see this played out? Jesus is saying, I can tell she has been forgiven much because she loves much. You, on the other hand, I'm wondering about you, Simon. Thanks for inviting me to lunch, but you need to be forgiven. The reason that I do this story and this parable right here is because this really gives you the context for discipleship. This is the context right here. There aren't very many parables told by Jesus about forgiveness. A lot of them are about discipleship, and some of them, quite a few of them, are pretty harsh like this. But there's really something that goes before all of this obedience and commitment. What goes before is that here is your problem. You are a great sinner. I don't know what all you have done. But God does. We're pretty good at hiding the stuff that we don't want people to see, okay? But you can't hide anything from God. So we all have a great need for forgiveness. And only you can feel the real weight of that need. Okay? So this is just between you and God. You have a great need for forgiveness. He knows that. I love that song by Third Day. It's Who I Am. I should have brought it and played it for you. It's the chorus of it is, do you know who I am? Have you seen the things I've done? It's like he's standing before God and saying, you want me? Have you seen what I've done? It sort of reminds me of Peter after the fishing boat incident in Luke chapter 5 when Peter comes back in and with a boat full of fish, and he goes up to Jesus and he says, Jesus, you need to leave because I am a sinful man. You don't want me. And Jesus says, au contraire. I'm going to make you into a fisherman of men. Follow me. He turned around. Peter followed him. Yeah. He knows exactly what you've done. Exactly what you've done. And he wants you. And He really does expect that your experience of forgiveness is going to change the way you live. And anybody who's looking will be able to see great love. And that love, that gratitude, that is what drives you. That's what motivates you. You don't serve him out of fear. I mean, that's almost what this looks like, isn't it? I'm bigger than you, you can't refuse my demands. That's just one way to contextualize this scenario. But see, the real point is, you don't serve him out of fear. You serve him out of gratitude. Because he has done more for you than you can ever do for him. And so, the basis of discipleship is forgiveness. I'm amused sometimes because I study the life of Jesus, and I'm amused sometimes when I read books on the historical Jesus say that, Jesus taught about the kingdom of God, blah, blah, blah. And he never talked about himself. Well, next Tuesday, I'm going to show you a series of parables that he told about himself, okay? So don't think that he never talked about himself. I know he does so directly in John's gospel with the I am the good shepherd, I am the light of the world. And it's true that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he talks a lot about the kingdom of God. But Jesus' message was all about forgiveness. The basis of discipleship, as we have seen right here, is forgiveness. Simon's problem is he needed it. This prostitute, she might have had a reputation, but that's not a problem. I think that story in Luke 7 is hilarious because, Jesus is probably the only man in that room who was comfortable with that woman being in there. He was totally all right with it. In fact, she was touching him. She was crying over him. And, and if you were a less secure person, you may be thinking, if you were Jesus, you may be thinking, gosh, I wish she wouldn't do that. Because all these people, they're talking. What are they thinking? What am I going to have to face tomorrow after this gets out? Jesus was totally okay. I just love it. Because he knew what she was all about. She had just been forgiven. She isn't the one with the problem. The host of the lunch was the one with the problem. The basis of discipleship is forgiveness. The motivation for discipleship is gratitude. We don't do this. We don't serve him for money or mention. We just don't. And if you do, you need to go home today and rethink this. Because the motivation that produces the kind of change and commitment that Jesus wants from you, that he demands from you, is gratitude. It's gratitude. Love is the only emotion that will produce the kind of abandoned commitment that Jesus expects, demands from you. So the basis is forgiveness. The motivation is gratitude. The demand of discipleship is Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, and I ended up having to ask you.
There you go. The demand of discipleship is complete, commitment, and radical obedience. That's the demand. Complete commitment, radical obedience. That's harsh, but that's it. This is the package, guys. But what looked really hard, it's not hard at all for those of you who have experienced forgiveness and are motivated by gratitude. There's nothing hard at all about saying yes to Him and no to everything else. So, giving you some things to think about. On Tuesday, we will look at another domain of parables that Jesus taught about Himself. It's very interesting, very, very, very fun to see Jesus put Himself in a parable. He does it not a lot, but He did it a few times. And so we'll look at those on Tuesday.